Okay, I had a vision, a very clear vision actually, of Rodney Browne, but it was very strange because it was like a movie scene set in the Jane Austen era. And the Jane Austen era is like basically 1775 to 1871 or something. So, and it was kind of set with people who are dressed like this. Okay, I know it's hard to see, but Jane Austen, you can Google it. And in the vision, I saw a cobblestone street, and there was a horse and carriage similar to that. And the street for cobblestone, and it looked like it was in Great Britain. And it was very much the era of the top hat, and the same era that George Washington, remember George Washington would have been around in 1775. The hat that kind of looks like a seashell. I think those were more military style hats that they would wear. So the men would wear top hats. The women would wear these very, very beautiful gowns. Anyway, the vision. Okay, so in the vision, it's kind of complicated, but I saw a carriage like that, cobblestone streets, and I saw Pastor Rodney. And he was wearing a dirty old shirt, and he was bound by chains. He was handcuffed and had his hands behind him. And he had chains on his feet. And there were soldiers in front of him and soldiers behind him, and he had been arrested. But the thing is, his skin was red. He had horns on when you see Pastor Rodney here in these pictures, his horns are on his face. In the vision, so when you look at this picture, you see Pastor Rodney Browne, and you see the horns on his face. In the vision that I saw, his horns were coming out of the top of his head. See those horns on his head? In the vision I saw, look at his devil eye. Look at his eyes. He looks like a snake is looking through his eyes. Look at that. Look at that. Look at his eyes. Look at this. I mean, the guy is of the devil. He's death, hell. He represents death, hell, and the grave. He represents the devil behind the pulpit of a major American church. His teaching represents the lies of Satan. Anyway, so in the vision, there was cobblestone streets. It was set during the 1780s or so. And he was bound by chains. And they were marching him through the street. And on his head, he had a bag over his head, but he had horns coming out of his head, and his skin was red. And he had this long tail that came out from behind him, and it was red, and it had this point on it, just like you see of the devil. And it was like he was under guard. And in the vision, I was standing watching him as they paraded him past. And then a soldier came up to me, and he had the hat on, and he had a scroll in his hand, and he said, "A scroll for you, sir." And then he bowed his head, and he did a little kind of kneel thing towards me, and he handed me the scroll. And then I took the scroll, and I knew that the scroll had a seal on it, and I knew nobody was allowed to open this scroll except for me, because it was addressed to me, and the soldiers aren't allowed to open the scroll. And so I received the scroll, and then I opened the scroll, and in the vision, I opened the scroll, and as I was watching the scroll, it disappeared, but it disappeared into me. And as I was laying there in bed, I started feeling the anointing because when the scroll came into me. So that was the vision I saw, is that it looks to me like Pastor Rodney, where he is right now, even though he seems to be free and he might still be pastor of the church. One, he's been exposed for who he is. Two, he looks like Satan, so he can't deceive anymore. And three, God is opposing him and revealing all about this guy. So that was the first part of the vision, though. Then in the vision, I opened the scroll and I felt the anointing, and I almost started to cry because I felt a really strong anointing. And then a few minutes later, I went back to sleep, and I had a second part 2 of the vision. And part 2 of the vision, we were in a courtroom. And Pastor Rodney was seated in the defendant's spot, in the place where they would seat a criminal. And the judge had this big white wig on and this black robe, and everybody in the courtroom was dressed like a Jane Austen movie. And I saw Adonica was up at the witness stand, and she was seated in the witness stand. She was wearing a white dress, and she was testifying. And they asked her, so when did you tell us about how when you first met Rodney? And she's like, well, when we first met, you know, everything seemed fine, and you know, he kept coming out, he kept showing up everywhere I went, and he would come and talk to me, and he basically, he was pursuing me. And then the counselor said, hold on, how long after you met Pastor Rodney did you realize that you were supposed to be married? And she goes, I think that he had already decided to marry me before we even met. And then the whole courtroom went into an uproar. Oh! And one young man stood up and said, this is wickedness! And the judge was like clacking the gavel, clack, 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 order in the court. And he was a big old judge with this big white wig that came down like this, and he had this big fat chin, and he was like, order in the court, or clack, clack, clack. And everybody was in an uproar. And a young man, and the next thing I know, this young man was being dragged out saying, what he did is wickedness. And then the courtroom finally calmed, and Adonica was like, had tears in her eyes, and she was gonna, and they're like, go on. And they're like, well, before that she had testified, when I met him, he didn't have the horns. He didn't have the long snake tail with the spike on it. His skin wasn't yet turned red. He seemed like a normal person. And then she went into her testimony about, well, when we first met, he was very aggressive and pushy, but he was a nice guy, and we were in the church. And then the counselor interrupted her. How long before you realized you were going to get married? And she goes, oh, well, it felt to me like Pastor Rodney knew we were going to be married before we even met. And that's when the crowd went insane, and the judge was like, order in the court, order in the court. So I'm just saying. So that was the vision I had. And there's more to it. I can't remember what it was. So there's more to this vision, and I got to think about it. God will remind me and show me. So I'll make another video that'll be part 3 of this.